I suppose it's about time to begin. Am I audible now? All right. Well, last night we were discussing and found that there are questions of meaning and questions of insight and all these other things that were interesting, but that the major point was that there's a contradiction in these questions. One wants insight, but one is afraid of it, and several other contradictions, I can't remember them, which all centered on what we call the ego, whatever that is. And I think we finally got to the point of what is the ego, you see, or even is there an ego, right? So if you ask what is the ego, you know, what are its qualities and so on, you're presupposing or assuming that it is there. So we might say we're not sure that it's there. That if it's so contradictory, perhaps it isn't there, right? Perhaps something else is there. Right. Now, that's where we were last night. So, what is the meaning of the ego, or what is the meaning of the word I am? You see, suppose you say I am this, I am here, I'm John Jones, you know, I am rich, I am poor, I am strong, I am weak, you know, I am educated, I am not. There are all sorts of qualities that can be attributed to the self, right? By means of the words I am. Now, but similarly, say if we ask what is the meaning of the word insight by itself, remember, without particular insight. So what does the word I am by itself mean? And we're saying that sort of question can't be answered right away. It requires sort of letting the question work, percolate.
It seems that I am is a fixed point of reference, something that is referring to the world or the world is referring back, some internal psychological reference. A
right.
Fixed point.
Yes, but where is it fixed?
It seems that it's fixed in the brain as a voice that seems to be commenting on what's going on. It seems to see commenting on thought and commenting on what it sees outside of itself.
Well, that's sort of an assumption one makes about the brain, knowing what you know about the brain, but one doesn't immediately experience the brain, right? That depends on being told about it. In fact, you never see your brain. And anyway, it's not obvious the brain is the source of thought, you see, to immediate experience. I think many of the Greeks thought that the heart was the source of thought and the brain was a way to cool the blood. It had a lot of holes in it. So you talk about a cool head to keep the blood cool so the heart can work right and think right, right? I mean, but still with that theory, the Greeks weren't very different from us, right? In other words, all these theories don't seem to change what the ego is, right?
It seems that it seems that the ego, the basic thing of it is division, because
is what?
Division.
What kind of division, though?
Division between, if for the moment you'll let me use the word me and everything else, whether that be the physical universe or within myself, my thoughts, my feelings, my, always that process of division creates a feeling or manifests a feeling or is a feeling, which perhaps is what we mean when we're saying I am.
Where does that feeling seem to be taking place?
Well, if you're feeling emotional, it may be in the heart. If you're feeling fear, it may be in the stomach. If you're feeling thought, it may be in the head, but it's
somewhere inside the body or inside the skin is sometimes.
Generally so, I would think, yes, except in some kind of transcendental experiences, perhaps.
Well, unless somebody is identified with something outside, right?
Well,
David, isn't it also part of the point that that sense of I being of a psychological nature doesn't necessarily have a particular location in physical space?
No, but that's right. But it may move. But generally it's felt to be in the body somewhere,
Of course.
moving around. But it could be felt to be outside. You see, you could identify with your country or your...
But the fact that it's not definitely localized in space is not one of its
Yeah.
necessarily one of its inherent contradictions.
No. That's a question of trying to find out what it is, you see. So you could say it seems to be a kind of center, localized somewhere, usually in the body. I think people who have some mental disturbance may feel that they're out in the room, you see, that somewhere, and therefore whatever's going on in the room is a threat to them. And it could be a threat to them, right? The walls are part of their... Just as you say, I extend out to my skin normally, but you could easily feel I extend out to the walls of the room, right? If you assume that. And you see, the boundary seems very variable. You see, if you take a blind man who is holding a stick tightly and tapping his way, you could see that he might feel he ends at the end of the stick, right? Where he's loosely connected to the rest of the world. But if he's holding the stick loosely, he'll feel he ends at his fingertips. Right? On the other hand, anybody may feel he wants to move his hand, and therefore he'll feel he's somewhere inside the body and the hand is outside, to be moved. Or you could say, I want to control my thoughts, so one part of me is inside somewhere trying to control another part, which is also inside. So the boundary is somewhere inside there, right? Or somebody could say, I am such and such belong to such and such a country, and therefore, in some sense, my boundary extends out there, right? If thy country is attacked, I am attacked. If you cross the boundary of the country, you have the same as if you cross my boundary, and that would be a threat, right? So, therefore, the boundary can be moved around according to how you're thinking, or according to the assumption that's being made as to what is the boundary, right?
It is, if you're looking in a mirror, like sometimes when I'm shaving, and you see you're only concentrating on your image in the mirror, but you feel the razor on your face. You can make a kind of a switch, if you do it consciously, and you can get the sense that the sensation is coming from the image in the mirror. If you want to do that, because you can't see your face except through the mirror.
No.
And so you can transfer the sensation to the mirror, and so while you hold that kind of a gestalt. You get the sensation that you are the image.
Yes, I am in the mirror. Yes.
In the mirror. But generally, we just associate ourselves with what we feel, where our sensors are.
Yeah, and see if you were shaving. See if you got too strong on that identification with the image, you might try to shave the image, but it wouldn't work, right?
As long as you use the image of the razor to do it.
Yeah, you would have to sort of be living within that mirror image.
Well, part of this is the image that we get from our own memories. In other words, even in Psychology 1 in school, they tell us the ego is formed as a focus of all of the memories we have, of all the things that we have thought and felt and done. And so we get a mirror from this. We remember all the things that we have thought, felt, and done, and we say, oh boy, that's me, they're singing my song, and they get identified with these memories, and therefore there must be somebody who did all of these things, and so we create an image of ourselves charged with this tremendous feeling of I exist, I am, which we're getting back to the I am thing, of feeling I am because I remember all of these things.
Yes, essentially making the assumption that all these memories belong to one entity, which you name I.
I remember it that way.
Yes, but you wouldn't remember it that way without that assumption. You see, memory is often very hard to get hold of, and people have even done tests with memories. Putting a lot of people here, having a lot of incidents suddenly happen unexpectedly, and then they ask people to describe what happened. Not only do they all disagree, but in 5 minutes later, it's all changed, and by an hour, all sorts of new things have been invented. And so, you see, memory is not all that reliable. It can only be held together by thought, you see. Somebody once gave a way of being sure you could remember 25 items by making a small story of them, you see, saying, I don't remember, the bird was flying in the air. The bird lit on the wire went into the house went to a telephone, the man answered the telephone, and so on. You see, you could take 25 steps like that and remember them because one led to the other, right? So that was a chain of thought will hold memory stable. But without a chain of thought, memory not only goes, but it gets replaced by all sorts of things that never happened. And therefore, a large part of what we call memory may be fantasy, right? Especially of early childhood.
Isn't it possible that there can be a sense of individuation even before memory? I mean, for example, a small child can perceive. I mean, because I think, therefore I am. But we know that very small children will actually perceive things, form concepts, apparently remember them, and act upon them. And yet, later on, when they're adults, they will have no memory of having done that, although their parents will tell them, or even have movies of events that they have absolutely no recollection of. So I wonder whether or not thought is essential, or at least, if not thought, self-referent thought, is essential to the process of individuation.
Yeah, well, you see, Piaget has gone into the development of, say, intelligence in very young children, and see, he says that he can follow what he calls sensory motor thought before language, in which, for example, the child will learn to take an object and turn it around, and then he turns around it again, discovering with surprise that it's the same object. So he learns that, or else he can learn that if an object disappears behind something and appears on the other side, first he treats it as two objects, one disappearing and another one appearing, and later learns that it's the same. Now, that sort of thought doesn't require language, and even animals have it. What? What?
It does require concept.
Yes, but even animals have that, you see, and animals can tell too, that sort of thing. And later, of course, it gets carried into language where you can carry it much further. Now, so probably thought begins very early, and also fantasies of various kinds. You see, one view is to say that thought begins as fantasy, to say the child may remember some general thing that happened, and through a repetition of a series of similar memories can form a sense of what happened, which is, say, the first notion, first sense of his own existence, right? And and then at a certain stage, the child starts to distinguish between two kinds of fantasies, one of which is recognized to be fantasy, and the other, which is reality, right? You see, the thought of reality is the same nature as the thought of fantasy, but you make a distinction according to certain tests that it has to satisfy, saying, if the thing is real, for example, it resists. It stands up. If you push it, it pushes back. If it's stable, everybody else sees it. See, the child may think that other people could see his own thoughts, then in the room somewhere, and then he finds they don't see it. So he says that's different, right, from a real thing that everybody sees. So but then he has to think of, suppose he isn't looking at the chair, he's thinking about it, a fantasy of it, image of it. And he knows, however, that chair is there, right? Whereas he might fantasize something else and know it's not there. Other people won't see it. But then there's a sort of a situation in between where he's not sure, in the dark room, whether these things are real or not, right? Which he may fantasize. So the idea is that, one idea is that this thought begins as images, which is the primary language, the first language, which is not very communicable, and then it's turned into words. And then one of the problems arises that the person forgets the image language, but he still got it. So when the word gives rise to the image, then the image is felt to be something else, which has a kind of reality, you see. I don't know if you see what I mean. That whereas in the beginning, there may have been a consciousness that it is an image, right? But you see, along with our verbal thought may go a lot of imagery, some of which we're conscious of, but some of which we're not conscious of as image. But we tend to think of it as some process going on in the system, right? That may be a very important point, which we have to come back to as to how the sense of ego develops.
Well, I know Piaget has one theory of development. The psychoanalytic theorists, although they have less precise and less, in fact, very little exact data to prove what they're talking about. Nevertheless, theoretically, they have a model in which they say, well, there is a lot of development and language formation and concept formation up to a certain point in time, and then something happens which generates anxiety in the child. Up until then, the sense of security is unimpaired. And they talk about, most everybody has an earliest memory. Not everybody, but a lot of people have an earliest memory that they can refer back to. And they refer to that as a screen memory, which screens out all the events that happened prior to that, because something happened just prior to that, which created anxiety and therefore created the self, which was something other than just the individual.
Yeah, well, we could discuss that fear may help to create the self, but pleasure may help to create the self. You see, I think memories which the child may remember various things and recreate the sensation by the memory. You see, if he remembers pleasant experiences, then he would recreate pleasure from those experiences as a fantasy. Or he could remember fear or other things. But some self-reference is built into the whole system, you see, even before thought. I mean, for example, you have what's called proprioception. A person is aware immediately that he has moved something that it has not moved itself. The child learns that fairly early, that distinction. That, see, and that's a very important distinction. You see, if you move something, you know you have moved it, or there's a distinction between that object being moved by you and if something suddenly moved your arm, you would tell that was different from you moving it. Now, the nerves are built so as to be able to know that. Now, it's all sort of wired up almost. So, that can, I've discussed this before, that there was a woman who suffered a stroke while she was asleep, and she woke up apparently being attacked by somebody, but when the light was turned on, she was hitting herself because her sensory nerves had been damaged, but not the motor nerves. And therefore, she had no way of knowing that she was hitting herself, and therefore the assumption was made something else was hitting her. And the more she struggled against that assailant, the more she was hitting herself. Now, there is some proprioception in the body very early, and the distinction between actions which originate in the body and those originating outside is perceived. You see, as a functional difference. This doesn't necessarily, so the notion that there is the self as a kind of center, the body as a center of activity, is probably natural. Animals obviously must have it too, and they can tell that distinction. And I think, see, the question is, how does this natural and useful distinction turn into the contradictions of the ego?
The word ego in the Greek language is ego.
What?
The word ego
Yeah.
in the Greek language is ego. And when I pay attention, even pronouncing the word ego, ego,
Yeah.
ego, I have a sense of separation. So the ego or ego has a strong sense, has a sense of separation. It by itself in its own sound.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but that may be built up by the way that word is used. You see, over many years that, we want to say why there's a sense in which you're aware of something that has happened. There is a certain distinction between the body and the rest of the world, which I think is reasonable, you see, and it should be made. But there's a distinction between actions originating in the body and actions which have not, or actions which act on the body, right, from outside. Now, that distinction is limited because finally, in the long run, whatever goes out, it has consequences that come in and vice versa. But in the short run and for many purposes, that is really a valid distinction. So we say that this notion of I cannot be entirely wrong, or probably would never have arisen. No. In other words, something which was correct and useful has somehow developed in a way which has gone wrong.
I think part of the problem is that as biological organisms, each individual is born with that survival need, and that is a very selfish kind of a feeling. But it's if human beings hadn't been born with this over the generations, we would have died out a long time ago. So there's a very strong survival need, and as you grow up and are socialized, then you have that contradiction between that selfish kind of core of I have to survive, however, whether it's physical or psychological survival, and that has to be socialized. And I think a lot of the contradictions come from that there's this basic selfish component that's at least partly biological, and then all these other things, developmental things, impinge on that and influence it. And so much of the contradiction comes from the need to give and the need to survive.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if we should call it selfish, which really has a very negative connotation. It's necessary that each person have an instinct to survive and take care of his own needs. Nobody else can take care of them. You see, if you are in danger, say suddenly, but something is approaching you, animal is approaching you, then you've got to take care of it, right? You see, so it seems to me that instinct itself is necessary. And you see, it doesn't follow also that society is unselfish. See, very often the worst forms of selfishness arise from society, which insists that people be selfish and take, you see, and against even what their instincts might be. And it's not so simple to say that selfishness originates in the individual's instincts and the society is trying to overcome them, because society often is very selfish too. It wants to, to impose its will on another tribe, and it also imposes its will on all its members, and often in very irrational ways. So society is kind of another kind of self, another kind of ego, a collective ego, right? But the thing is that I wanted to say there seems to be at least a beginning where that sense of separate self has a valid place. The instinct to protect the body is surely necessary, or else people would never, as you say, people would never have survived. but sometimes it may go too far and may impinge in other areas where it doesn't make sense. Now, but why it does so, we have to find out, you see.
I think perhaps you're pointing out that any animal, when it's challenged, has to respond to that in order to survive.
Yes.
The thing which differentiates man, really, is that he can conceptualize when a challenge isn't really present and worry about it. And
yes.
He can conceptualize about death, forecast that, and create a whole structure to deal with challenges which aren't actually here now, and then give importance to that structure itself.
Yes, well, that, in other words, somewhere the thing goes wrong, you see, that when thought comes in, right? And this ego, and the sense of, there is built in some sense of survival and some sense of distinction of the body from the environment, seeing that it can be the source of actions that originate in the body, or actions can act on the body.
This goes further than that. I think it joins to what you are saying, is that at the beginning, what we call ego is probably a very useful thing for our survival or being able to manage ourselves as individuals. However, the sense of I has a nature which is somewhat schizophrenic, I would say. It is multi-layer. One sense is what we talk about here is the ego itself. And it comes in terms of I get angry, I get frustrated, and so on. But then there is another layer to it, which is not I wouldn't say it's the ego. That is when I, all right, again comes the word I look at this person who gets angry. There is this sense of someone stepping back and looks at this angry man doing this and that. Then there is even a further layer of it, as if there is a observer over and beyond all this thing and says, well, look at this man doing all these things, looking at itself, getting angry, and all these other things, how nice or how bad, and so on. So there is a multi-layer aspect of it, as if when we start out from this possibly necessary, sure necessary sense of survival, there is development to this whole thing. The self is more than the ego, I would say.
Yes,
ego is only a small part of it.
Well, it may be. You see that I was saying that. But suppose we say, how did it come about that this sense of an individual being turned into this distorted sense of an ego? You see, that we feel somehow this sense of ego is distorted. It leads to contradictions and absurd actions and so on. In fact, it begins to get in the way of survival. You see, this is the peculiar thing, that the ego gets in the way of survival. People have often done all sorts of crazy things because of the ego, right? And have failed to survive. And that's the contradiction. If you say the ego is aimed at survival, it doesn't really produce survival on the whole. And in fact, as far as the human race is concerned, it may bring about the end, right?
Or could we say that it's in its static nature? If the ego is just doing what the ego does, it may be useful up to a point, but it's somewhat an open system. It requires something more than itself to be able to operate in an orderly way in the proportion as it probably ought to be or meant to be. Hello. That is, once it turns into itself, there is nothing else beyond and over it. There is no integration of any other sort. The ego becomes destructive. It builds on itself and gets larger and larger.
Yeah, but why should it do this? You see, if the ego is aimed at survival and doing this is destructive, then why does the ego, whose aim is survival, become destructive? You see, that is there's a problem there.
Maybe it doesn't have the capacity, just as if when one looks at the past, one looks at it only through distortion. It would seem that probably the same thing is true of projecting into the future. You can only see a distortion of what actually.
But that isn't necessarily so. You see, we have thought which can think of the past, our memory of the past is unreliable, but we can make records that are more reliable and make it up, and then we can have knowledge from the past, which enables us to meet contingencies. Saying, people learned that you must plant at a certain time and harvest at a certain time and store up the food because the time will come when you don't have any, and so on. Right. That was all reliable knowledge which help to meet the future, right?
That's one form of knowledge.
Yeah.
That could be repeated and could be tested. And
yeah, so that was a step, an important achievement, right? But then, similarly, the ego takes knowledge about how it can feel good about itself, you see. It says, I want to have a good feeling about myself, right? And it says one way is to say, I can think that I'm very good, that I'm right, that everything I do is right, that I'm essentially perfect. And I can indicate to other people that is what they should say to me. And I will say something similar to them in return. But then it breaks down, right? And then somebody says the opposite, right? Which creates pain, right? So the ego engages in something false for some odd reason. You see, you can say thought can be very useful, but any thought which is aimed at something false cannot be useful. It must be destructive, right? There's something false about the ego, and it's very peculiar that the ego is so deeply involved in deception, not only deception of others, but self-deception.
Well, isn't the ultimate self-deception the fact that it's indestructible? Because it wants, you mentioned it would like pleasure, it would like to have people say to it things it wants to hear. But it seems that even beyond that kind of pleasure, the ultimate pleasure is just convincing itself that it's going to survive and continue from one moment to the next, and we all have a feeling that we go on forever.
Yeah, well, why should the ego get pleasure out of thinking of something false? You see, that it's unclear, you see.
Could we say...
What is the relationship between thought or the ego and that entity and instinct?
What?
The relationship between this thought, the body of thought, the images, the ego, and instinct.
Yeah, well, that may be a complex relationship. Perhaps we could discuss that a little later, you see. But I think, let's say we have this question now. There's a peculiar thing going on with the ego, that it seems to take pleasure out of deceiving itself.
Well, David, could we say this, that the ego is inherently unstable? It's built somehow, it builds itself, or builds, maybe inherently, heaven knows how much is planted into this whole thing. It's unstable. Rather than saying it's false, it's by itself is unstable. It goes to some degree, does the pleasurable thing, but brings about the unpleasurable things, and cannot complete the circle of doing what it's supposed to do but on its own. It goes unstable in one direction or other. Rather than saying that it's false and it goes into deceptions.
But it does go into deceptions. I mean, it's you see, why should the ego be deceptive? You see, why should thought ever be deceptive?
Okay. Are we on an assumption that we're talking about the ego?
Well, whatever it is. I mean, I'm using the word ego just to describe the phenomenon.
Right, but again, I feel like we're having this thing outside ourselves.
Yeah. Well, why does thought about myself go on in such a way? I'll leave the ego out and say, when I think about myself, this thought so often becomes deceptive, self-deceptive, whereas the function of thought should be not to be deceptive. You see, if you say thought is aimed at survival, deceptive thought will surely lead to destruction.
But isn't it that it seems that one realm thought work functions, but when it moves into another realm, it doesn't seem to belong there. It doesn't know how to work. It takes the same process in the realm of knowledge and applies it to the psychological realm, but it doesn't.
But why doesn't it work? You see, as the assumption is obviously you can apply it in both. That's the natural assumption.
No.
I mean, people naturally have done that all the time, right?
I've done it,
but I mean, it seemed natural. Nobody saw any reason not to.
But that's what I'm wondering. It doesn't seem to belong. It doesn't seem to work.
But why not? You see, it won't be enough to say it doesn't seem to work. That won't stop it.
Because of the very function of it.
Well, what is the function?
Does that deceptive building of the ego and of the thought, is it just which takes place in a blind way? It's not aware, otherwise it would be deceptive. It's because it's a very strong demand for security.
Well, that doesn't make sense. You see, I say I very much want security, And therefore, I deceive myself and get into danger, you see.
Yes, but it doesn't know if he gets into the danger.
But why not? I mean, what destroys, sometimes it should be obvious. You see, suppose you have a confidence man, you see, and he tells you all sorts of good things about yourself, and then you therefore say, I must believe him in order to get pleasure. Therefore, he then says, now if you invest your money here, you will get 25% interest, and so on. And you say, yes, okay, that'll be wonderful. And therefore, you then soon find you have lost your money. Now, your purpose was to be very secure. You thought you would be secure by having a lot of money. You end up having no money and no security.
You asked what the function of thought was. Why doesn't it apply to work?
Well, any reasonably intelligent person would say, I must watch, be careful here, right?
I think part of the problem is that we want to be comfortable now.
Well, no, but this fellow wants to be comfortable also in the future. He wants to make a lot of money, you see.
Right, but in order to feel comfortable now about the future, he says, if I make 25% in the future, I will be secure, and that feeling makes me comfortable now.
But what's wrong with that? You see, if I say, if I can be reasonably confident that the future is going to be good, then I say I feel good now. I'm happy, right? That the future. I suppose
that's where the deception lies. Is
well, not necessarily.
Present feeling of comfort.
And
that's more important than the truth.
Yeah, but suppose somebody tells you, you now have reasonably secure prospects for the next X years, right? And you say, that certainly feels better than to say it's all unsecure, right?
Right.
But I mean, that's reasonable to say, you see, there's no deception there yet.
It's an ancient thought to compare and measure, in that sense. And
but measurement is necessary, you see.
And a certain realm is necessary.
But what's wrong with having it in this realm? It's not clear. You haven't made it clear. You see,
I know.
Unless we see why it's wrong, it's not enough.
Because it measures psychologically.
But what's wrong with measuring psychologically?
Because it seems to cause conflict.
It seems to, but why? You see, we'll never stop this if we don't see why.
Well, in the realm you're just saying you invested 25% and it's a good deal. You have the projection of that kind of financial security, but there's still the fact that there is no physical security, because I could die of a heart attack tomorrow and the interest wouldn't mean anything.
Yeah, well, that's all added to it, but still, when the person who is subject to this confidence trick is not thinking of that. He's thinking...
No, but we're asking why the ego deceives itself.
Why?
And the ego deceives itself because it wants to think, I'm going to be alive tomorrow, the next day, 5 years.
Well, not only that, but I'm going to be comfortable tomorrow and have what I want tomorrow.
Right, but even I would take discomfort if I'm at least alive. You know, if you give most people a choice of living in prison or being shot right now, they'll take living in prison because the desire for continuity and for the security of I will exist in the future.
Yeah, well, this fellow...
And that has to be deceptive, because obviously we don't have that security, really.
Well, I don't see how the question of health is connected with this question of money. You see, here's a person who is reasonably healthy, and he says, okay, something may happen to me, but it's not likely. I'm not worried about it, but I'm worried about money, you see. If I don't have enough money, I may be healthy, but my health may suffer. You know, all sorts of things could go wrong, and I'll be very unhappy. And anyway, it would be so nice to have all that money. Now then, somebody comes along and starts to flatter you and say, talk nicely to you. And then he says, here I have a wonderful investment, which will assure your future.
But again...
But now any reasonable person would be cautious, right?
Right.
But that very person would have been cautious if he hadn't been subjected to this treatment, right? By the confidence man. If somebody else who is not a skilled confidence man comes along, he will not get away with that trick, right?
Doesn't that kind of deception start very early, and aren't the confidence men really the people who raise us? I mean, for example, there's a famous, or well-known essay by Aaron Horney entitled Self-Idealization versus Self-Realization. And which she points out that there are a lot of young people who want to be one thing, that they feel that this is their natural development, like a boy has a natural propensity, let's say, to mathematics and wants to be a mathematician, and at some point in time a parent may come along who has his or her own anxieties about life and says to the child, well, you can be a mathematician, but a mathematician is never going to be a very wealthy or economically secure person. Why don't you think of other alternatives? And then the self-deception begins at that time very early on in life and perpetuates itself. And the person winds up at the end of his life having something that he never really wanted.
Well, it may begin very early or very late, but I'm trying to say, what is its nature? You say, how does it come about?
Well, we've been saying that the nature of ego is the statement, I am.
Yeah, I don't see how that says I am a self-deceiver, you see. It doesn't say that.
Well, because in the first place, what we're saying, as we said last night, ego may not exist at all. So merely to say I am may in itself be self-deception.
It may be, but it's not obvious, you see.
It's not obvious, but that's part of what we...
Well, what's the activity that's taking place at the moment that this thing happens?
Yeah, how does it come about? You see, that's what is it? What is deception? Self-deception and falseness, and you see, what is truth? You see,
Why does the child buy the story?
Well, yes, the child buys the story. The adult buys the story because he wants. Well, we don't quite see why. You see.
What choice does the child have, David?
Well, some children don't buy the story. They go ahead and make their own lives.
Is the ego deceptive, the self-deception coming out of our strong phobia? Phobia, phobia means fear from life, fear from organically growth. So there is no confidence if we have that strong fear. The confidence is in our organism, in our cells. But for some reason, something goes at a certain point, something happens, and then that phobia starts developing, and then I have to find other things, and then the self-deception starts together. I'll bring phobia together with self-deception.
Well, fear may be connected with self-deception, but I want to raise another question. You see, if you're afraid, there's no reason to deceive yourself. You see, the purpose of fear is to do something that will make you safer. Deception may make you worse. It's unsafe. You see, so I'm saying, how do you deceive yourself? You see, in order to deceive yourself, you must conceal somehow something which you really already know. Yeah. Right?
No, I think that is the fact that the ego, being insatiable for everything from security to stuff to psychological strokes, the whole thing, the ego has to be a vacuum at the center. It has to be nothing in order to want to fill that with all this stuff.
But why does it accept this? The deception. See, if the ego is nothing, why does it accept the self-deception that it is something? You see.
Well, it needs it for security.
But it doesn't produce security. It's the major form of source of insecurity.
Yeah, all right, that's good.
We keep using the word deception, but as you pointed out, there's a certain implication in that word of concealment.
Yes.
But also, there seems to be, at least to me, there's an implication that there's a concealer in the use of the word, which is somehow tripping me up when I go to think about it. If we substitute just making a mistake or some equivalent word.
Yeah, but a mistake you're ready to correct. You see, everybody makes mistakes, and when it's pointed out or when they see evidence, they say, okay, I made a mistake. You see, if I said I thought I was going north and suddenly I see I'm going south, I say there's no resistance, there's no defense. I say I just turn around and go south. But if, with regard to what we call the ego, if you make a mistake and say I thought I was really right and doing everything right and doing a wonderful job, and now I suddenly see it's not so, it's the other way around, then the ego doesn't want to turn around, you see, and say that's it. You see, it doesn't want to accept evidence against whatever gives it pleasure. And
starts making excuses.
Yeah, we make excuses and so on. And that's part of the deception. You see, that there's a process of deception going on, a process of concealment, of covering up something which it could know, which in fact at some level it probably does know.
Well, it doesn't seem to make sense for a person or a system to make an assumption which will guide it, for the next few steps, and then change that assumption on the first piece of evidence.
No, but the ego doesn't stop at the first piece. It
Right.
keeps on even at the 50th piece.
It persists for quite a long time.
Sometimes for centuries, you see, for the ego of the country, right?
Well, is it that we've become so habituated to the pleasure that we sometimes get from the functioning of the ego? We've become so habituated to that we can't give it up.
Well, why not? You see, I'm trying to say we haven't got to the bottom of it. You see that?
Yeah. Doesn't it seem as though we have a remarkable number of very quick answers and strong opinions in order to answer this question? Mm-hmm. And many of these quick answers incidentally have the effect of subtly excusing the fact of self-deception.
Yeah, or at least making it natural or inevitable. You see, that is, many of these answers would imply that self-deception was inevitable, whereas the whole point of our discussion is perhaps it's not inevitable and we could get out of this.
Well, you're challenging and a very, or at least inquiring, rather than challenging, a very fundamental assumption that psychologists and people who have thought about human nature have made for a very long time, namely that self-deception is a consequence of anxiety.
Well, it may be, but it doesn't explain it. Huh?
And what you're suggesting is that possibly there's something deeper than this.
Yeah. I mean, surely anxiety helps to lead to self-deception. We all know that, but it doesn't explain how it comes about. You see, if you're frightened, the rational response would be, by all means, avoid self-deception, because that'll only make it worse, right? And I say the fact that you're frightened, if you're really seriously frightened, you must be first of all frightened of your capacity to deceive yourself.
Is it that we are attached to the previous observation, or the previous condition? Like just before this event happened, we deceive ourselves because it's different from what we...
Well, but it's not clear why that implies self-deception. You see, very often we know about previous conditions and don't deceive ourselves, you see, but use them for reasonable purposes. You see.
What's interesting to me about everything you're saying is that there are a few models that one can pick out of persons that perhaps have been less self-deceptive than others. And it seems as if there's like a cluster to which the majority of us are pulled like magnets, and we keep perpetuating the same myth, which is built on a false assumption. And it permeates everything, all of our social sciences, everything that we do and think and feel. And then when you read or see or know someone that's broken out of that myth in some way, it's a very difficult challenge to them. They somehow do it, and I feel that they're in that, whatever the pure state might be. But it always, from anyone that I've ever heard about or read about, they talk about the difficulty of changing that whole set. And somehow, somewhere along the way, we bought into a false set, somewhere. And it's almost as if it began to build a foundation over here that's not built on anything, but over here is our real foundation. We have to somehow make that quantum leap or jump over there.
David, if I may, I wanted to ask again. It relates to what she's saying. I said, what choice does a child have? And you said, well, some children get out of it. Mm-hmm. But then you turn around and say, no, we're all in it.
Well, they get out.
It doesn't seem like you can have it both ways. Either we're in it, most of us are in it, or some of us get out of it. Well, in that case, it might invalidate the idea that children somehow reach an autonomy regardless of what happens to them early on.
Well, I'm saying that if you take the whole thing, we're all in it, but there are certain parts of it that people get out of. You see, like the parents may put pressure on a child to do something that makes money rather than what he wants to do really. Many children will give way to that, and some children don't. You see, but then even those who don't probably get caught in something else, you see.
It might be earlier, though. It might be something in which the parents, for instance, won't allow the child to express some natural needs the child might have as an infant.
Yeah, it may all start very early.
The parents don't like the child, for instance, to express anger or express feelings of discomfort because it makes them feel like bad parents. So every time the child cries, they suppress it. They act negatively. They ignore the child. They show indifference. So the child's natural security is threatened. So it at that point begins to deceive itself about its own feelings, because to express those feelings would be dangerous.
It may.
And that starts the whole process rolling.
That may happen, you see. I'm trying to say, really, what is the nature of this process? How does what can an adult do about this process? Really, that's our first question.
That's a different question, though. The first question was, how did it come about? And I'm proposing how it came about, and it came about perhaps even before any kind of real ego development took place at all.
It may be, you see, but what I want to say is I don't think we're going to be able to get hold of it at that level. You see, we have got to see the thing that we can see here. Now,
could we change that question to why does it come about? I mean, if it's happening right now.
Yeah, you see why self-deception is constantly happening, and a child will get into it. A child may also pick up from parents that that's the way to be because they're doing it, and unconsciously he starts imitating them.
But his whole survival may be dependent on his continuing that behavior as far as the infant is concerned.
It may be.
Talking about the child. What about us?
But why do parents then adopt such a irrational procedure?
Because it happened to them too.
Yes, but then we haven't got to the end of it, you see.
But now that we're discussing it and it's in front of us, why do we continue to do it?
Yes, I mean, we can discuss how it might have started. Now, maybe I'll just finish up by discussing my views as to how it may have started. These are all speculations, which are interesting. But you see...
Is self-deception inherent?
What?
If my grandparents had it, is it inherent?
Not necessarily. We don't know. You see, you're saying they got it from their parents and so on. We don't know exactly how it started, you see, but... I'm going to propose one reason why it's there, you see. Now, you see, this is based on the idea that some people have proposed there are roughly three brains in the human being. You see, the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, and the new neocortex, the new brain, which is more intellectual, and which also has a powerful imagination, right? Now, so... Let's say evolution took place very slowly, and the mammalian and the reptilian brain became moderately well integrated. And as far as the mammal is concerned, it functions in a way so that its emotional responses are more or less the right response. That if something is good for it, it will feel pleasure, and if something is bad for it, it will feel pain or fear. Or if it needs to fight, it will feel anger, and so on, rage. And therefore, the mammalian brain is sort of, the emotional part is in a fairly direct contact with the world of nature. Right? Now, and it provides more or less right responses, although they can be wrong in individual cases. For the survival of this species, it works out more or less right. Now, now then suddenly, according to this theory, in a rather short time by evolutionary standards, this brain enlarged to this large neocortex, which has both an intellectual function and an imaginative function, and and now the new thing to notice is that the major environment of the old brain is now not nature but the new brain. You see, because nature is now filtered through the new brain, right? So now. This you can see now that responses that were adequate before are no longer adequate. You see, how is that? Now, see, the new brain has a powerful intellectual, emotional function. Imaginative function. It can produce images, which the old brain finds it hard to distinguish from direct perceptions of nature. Right? Therefore, it can produce very attractive images, and the old brain says, good, let's have more, you see. Or it can produce frightening images, and the old brain is terrified, right? It says, get rid of them quickly. So the new brain, as a matter of fact, depends very much on the old brain for its motive power, for its wish to do anything at all. Probably left to itself, it might do nothing, you see. So therefore, that's the way it's built. It takes its cue from the old brain as to what it's got to do, right? it's got to solve problems for the old brain, for example. And therefore, if the new brain, say if these images come up and some nice pleasant image comes up, there is a strong message comes from the old brain, continue this, build it up. So the thought process has got to be adjusted to build up this nice pleasant image, right? It may not be correct anymore, but that's what it's doing, right? Right? And vice versa, if you have a very frightening image, it says get rid of it. You see, think something else, think another thought which says that it's gone, right?
Substitute the one with the other.
Yes, but in order to do that, you must have another assumption. You see, if I assume that everything is good, then I get the nice image, and therefore the old brain says, "Good, let's have more of that." Think some more on that line. And if I think the bad things are happening, I get a bad image, and the old brain says, "Get rid of that. Think something else, which is nicer." Right? You see, so that would be the beginning of deception. You see, to say that the system has begun to go wrong. It's no longer straight, you see, it's no longer true. You see, the word true in English means straight, really, true line, honest, straight, and faithful. And in Latin, the word veros means that which is. So, therefore, you could say truth is to be honest and straight and faithful to that which is. And the false is not as crooked, you see, the false twists it now. So, the point is that the process has begun to become false rather than true, not straight. You see, it's not a question of particular content being incorrect or correct, right? Even if something is incorrect, the process can be true because it's ready to straighten it out, right? To correct it. Or sometimes if a correct statement can be used to cover up something that's false, right? So we must distinguish between correct, incorrect, true, and false, right?
But don't go too fast.
Yeah. See,
the proposal seems to be locating what we were talking about as sense of ego in the old brain.
No, and then in the failure of the old brain and the new brain to be properly related.
Yeah, but the old brain is the one that in a sense feels the pleasure and then calls for a continuation of pleasurable sensations from the neocortex.
Yeah, but but it feels the pleasure because of what the new brain has produced. You see, for example, the new brain can produce the assumption of necessity of certain things to get a sense of security, right? You see, the old brain wants to have a sense of security, which is only natural. Right?
But somehow that assumption doesn't carry any pleasure with it. It's when that is then somehow connected to the old brain, then the pleasure.
Yeah, but you see, the new brain is constantly making things look, the fantasies look more and more real,
right?
And therefore it's contributing to the deception. You see.
I'm just trying to look at the proposal, and it seems as though the center of the ego is that which has the pleasure and the pain.
No, because by itself it wouldn't make trouble. You see, if there were not, in the animal situation, it's really correct to have that pleasure and pain. See, the old brain is not being, what shall we say, malicious or anything. It's just doing what comes naturally, right? As an animal brain, it just simply said when pleasure came, it gave the signal to go on with it, right? And when pain came, it gave some signal to stop it, to do something that would cut it down. Now, the old brain was therefore functioning in the way in which it was, as it were, designed to function, right, by evolution. Now then, it suddenly got surrounded for some reason which it had nothing to do with, I don't know, it got surrounded by the neocortex, right? And found it.
I think that's interesting how that might come about, but
we don't know exactly.
But it also carries another factor, David, that we are saying that the origin of the problem is innate. It's built in. Somehow this thing happened, and now we have a system which somehow, as I use the word unstable, it's really not coordinated too well. Something happened along the way, over and beyond our present to do anything about it. It's there.
It's built into the structure of the situation, but see, therefore it was the inevitable fate of humanity to fall into this problem. The question is the destiny of it, but do we have another destiny to rise above it? You see, that otherwise we're finished, right?
Yes. Right.
Is this quality of the neocortex, is that what we also call forethought, the ability to project?
Yes, and the ability to imagine, to project, to think abstractly, to imagine at the same time, to connect those two together. The right and the left brain, you see, the right brain does the calculations, and the left brain, it's displayed in the left brain by imagination.
So then, using the term forethought, that's going beyond what's going on right now.
Yeah, that was really a useful and necessary capacity. See, every one of these things by itself is right, but together they go wrong. You see, I'm trying to say you can't blame it on any one, right?
Well,
the old brain is very good in its emotional ability. We need, as a matter of fact, it was right for the animal, and it's still right if it can only be integrated. And the neocortex, and with all its capacities, can do all sorts of great things.
Was the old brain the seat of instinct?
It contains instinct, yes. And it connects to the base of the spinal column, where there are more instincts, right?
Could we say that the old brain, you say it's all fine and it's all was fine and all in
Well, not
order.
exactly, but it worked anyway.
Yes, but could we say that its perfectness also includes that it is somewhat open? After all, the imposition of the neocortex somehow had to be able to use the degree of freedom available in the lower brain. So the lower brain has not been complete on its own. It somehow needed the development.
Yeah, perhaps it did, you see, but we're saying perhaps this was potentially a tremendous thing, but somehow a certain problem wasn't solved, which prevented it from realizing its potential.
You're saying the trouble is that the old brain is no longer seeing reality, but the neocortex's symbolization of reality.
Mostly,
okay. But that explains what's happening, but doesn't say anything about how to get out of it.
Well, we'll have to come to that. You see, I mean, I think we've got to get into it more deeply. Yeah.
It would seem to me that one of the difficulties here is that the feelings that the mammalian brain gets from the images or fantasy, if you want to call it ego or fantasy, it would seem to me that one of the difficulties is that the feelings are felt and that whole system is faster than thought.
It is, yes. Therefore, the neocortex cannot deal with it. You see, that's very true. You see that the neocortex has started something that it cannot handle. You see, it produces some nice fantasies. The old brain responds quick, and the neocortex is now controlled by those urges from the old brain. And it doesn't know what to do with those urges. It isn't producing them itself. The neocortex also does not understand that the old brain is its environment, right?
I'm sorry, I missed what you said. The neocortex
does not really understand that a key part of its environment is the old brain. It thinks the environment is out there entirely, right?
It's the woman beating herself.
Yeah.
Well, Carl Sagan in The Dragons of Eden made a contribution to this, a big one. He pointed out, as you said, these old brains and how they affect us. But the point is that the spine is the fish brain, and fish are territorial. And so a large part, we even go to war because of territoriality, because we still have this.
Yeah.
This is the instinct that you were pointing out. And then the reptile, and everything since the reptile, wants to be the top reptile, the top baboon, the president. And
that's exactly it.
So Sagan pointed out, just to throw it out for people without making any conclusions, that Washington, D.C., the whole thing operates on being top baboon of arising from stage to stage to stage, and until you're God or somebody, there's no end to this desire to
well,
be
the trouble is there is an end.
There is the question of this. All of these desires, we can't go anywhere until we deal with these things, which I guess is the point you were making.
Yes, that's just the point that the new brain has the old brain as a very big part of its environment, but it isn't doing anything. It doesn't know what to. It doesn't even know it, or if it does know it, it has no notion of what to do about it. Yeah, so that's one more question.
But the new brain. Like I can imagine something from the past or the future which can then elicit pain or pleasure from my old brain. Yet part of me is aware that it's a fantasy, that I have imagined it, as opposed to if I'm driving in my car, I'm suddenly it starts pouring and I have to take extra caution to drive. I know that's happening in the present. So part of the neocortex, even though the signals are the same for my hypothalamus, that they're both happening. Some part of me knows this is happening currently in this body right now, and something else was the past or the future. Because without that, I think we would all.
Well, yes. Well,
a long time ago. So what is that?
It's only up to a point. You see, when the fantasy which creates the ego is not seen to be fantasy, but it is felt to be the most immediate reality. You see, some fantasy we can see through, but the fundamental fantasy we are not able to see. Anything very powerful just takes charge, you see.
But if you can use the source that allows you to see the fantasy exists at all, even the fantasy of the past and the futures, could you use that source to see could that source be built up to see the fantasy?
Well, it doesn't work because when the emotions become all powerful, they just flood the whole system, so that doesn't work. It's turned to self-deception.
Another aspect of it, could it be that according to what you described, the old brain does have what we generally call the ego, maybe in a relatively well-balanced way operating there. When this new brain comes along, that's where we probably should call maybe a development of a self, which then we do have this sense of saying, well, I know better, I shouldn't get angry. Where the anger would belong to a mechanism of the ego, the one who says, now I know better, would be part of the new brain, a self which has various images that he shouldn't have this and this attributes.
Yeah, but that really adds to the problem. You see, that the new brain doesn't really understand what the problem is. That's what I wanted to say. Maybe we'll call a halt here, but the theories which the new brain has made about the situation have really aggravated the situation because they too are false, you see. In other words, that the assumptions that the new brain has made about the situation have contributed to making it far worse than it would otherwise have been. That's the point I wanted to make. Well, suppose we call a halt for 15 minutes where you have some refreshments here. Well, we're saying that there's some inadequacy of the relationship between the old and the new brain. That it was because of the speed with which the new brain developed in evolutionary terms that they did not come to harmony, and each one was sort of doing its own thing and interfering with the other as it did so, right? Without knowing it was doing so or wishing to do so. So, in some sense, this problem was sort of a structural feature of the way it developed. You see that. It was the destiny of human beings to have this problem because of the very structure with which the brain developed. But at the same time, it's not, as we were saying, wired in that we must function this way. As far as we can see, that there may be a way out. You see, it's a functional disorder or something functionally out of order rather than structurally out of order. Right? If it were built into the structure, then we would just have to accept it. Maybe in a million years it would change, I don't know, if we have a million years. Now, So that's really where we are. That I'm saying that brings about, on the one hand, self-deception, and on the other hand, it brings about a distortion of the emotional reactions, right? The emotional responses. So each one the whole system is going off. Now, how that can change, you see, say neither of these brains is able to produce the change by itself. That's what I'm suggesting. You see, the new brain could realize at some stage that this is all going wrong, and it could say, no, it must change. But it cannot change the desires of the old brain, you see. And ultimately, the new brain must carry out the desires of the old brain, because that's the way it's built, right? It will try to impose new desires on the old brain, but it won't work. I mean, we can discuss that. And on the other hand, the old brain can say all this is wrong, feel it's all wrong, and say it must be right. See, there are two approaches. Say that would be to say, if only there were love, then it would all be right. But you see, that does not get at the imaginative fantasies produced by the new brain, right? Which the old brain cannot resist, right? So even what it calls love may turn out to be desire, right? Desire for those fantasies. Therefore, part of the deception. So it seems that it's a problem that cannot be solved on one side or the other.
Is it at this point that energy is involved? A new energy?
Maybe, but it's the energy of the whole brain. See, I'm trying to say, is it possible that there's a new way of functioning, which is not the old brain or the new brain, the old brain trying to control the new, or the new trying to control the old, but participating together, right?
Or there's another alternative, a linear extension of the suggestion you have here, is that we need a new layer of brain, over and above all these two, trying to coordinate down below.
Well, but it might get into the same problem, you see.
Well, but that could be the nature of development, that we have to go on and on and on endlessly.
Well, I don't know about that, but we may not have a chance. You see, it might take 1 million years to develop another brain. Now,
another layer of brain. Right?
What?
Another
layer, yes. No known creatures have been found who have it, you see. Now, maybe it's too hard to integrate more than 3 anyway.
When we quiet our mind.
What?
When we quiet our mind, which one of these things are we quieting?
Well, I don't know. You see, that may be a contradiction. See, the new brain may say the mind must be quiet. You see, I see that, right? But then it may try to impose quietness on itself and on the old brain. But you see, that would be deceptive, you see. That to impose something would merely be to conceal what is actually happening. That would be part of the deception.
Well, you mean the lizard is not impressed?
The what?
So the lizard is not impressed.
Well, not only that, but the mammal.
The
lizard pays no attention, nor does the mammal either. See, the monkey pays no attention either. You tell the monkey to be quiet, but it keeps on making noise.
Yeah, well, anyway, inside, whatever that is, seems to be the way out, or am I jumping ahead again?
Well, inside of the whole, you see. Yeah. See, the insight must deal with both sides at once.
Okay.
It seems that part of what you're suggesting is that this thing that we've been calling the ego, it has no locus.
It has no what?
No fixed point where it actually exists. It doesn't exist in the old brain. It doesn't exist in the new brain. Then where is it? And if it doesn't exist in some place, not only where is it, but what is it?
Now, what is the connection between these two brains and the ego, you see?
The ego, the movement of interference of the two brains?
Well, it involves that, you see, but it probably involves more, you see. I mean, we've really said that this begins to explain the deceptive, the feature of self-deception, right?
Is staying with the contradiction an aspect? This being aware that there's the deception and there's the old, the new, and one is right there and can't do anything about it?
Well, yes, that's so, but you see, I think we have to go very slowly there. See, we've merely sort of got a glimpse of where the problem is originating, right? Yeah. But this doesn't help when the problem is there. You see, you know, if somebody gets angry or hurt or something like that, then this glimpse is not powerful enough to really change anything, right?
May I ask, you made a comment about it being a functional rather than structural conflict between new and old brain. Is that an assumption that we want to go on, or do we want to look at that?
Well, I'm proposing that. You see, there's no evidence that it's an inherent structural defect, you see.
There's no evidence that it isn't, except for the fact that a couple people apparently have managed to live otherwise.
Yes, well, that would be enough already, because...
But that's our impression that their life really is that.
But then we have to say, see, the nature of our assumptions, you see, making a proposal that it's not a structural problem. You see, now, we don't know, but if we do assume it's a structural problem, that will be enough to stop further inquiry. Now, therefore, the only sensible thing is to say it may not be a structural problem. It probably isn't, in fact. We have some evidence that it squares up with the notion it isn't. And in fact, what I suggested, the whole mechanism which I suggested, suggests that it needn't be an inherent structural problem. You see that you have the old brain, the emotions and the intellect and the imagination. And once there's no inherent reason why they can't get together, I mean, you see, so why not propose they may get together? We've got to find out, inquire into this.
Well, let's see. A good deal of what the ego is identified with is the old brain stuff. Like, if you enter my house, I'll shoot you. In other words, I am identified with territoriality and the fish. And if I just plain want to be top baboon, therefore I am identified with the lizard. All of this is controlled by the lizard brain. And so on, straight through with the instincts. In other words, we are identified with these things. I'm going to be the president or something.
Yeah, but you see, what does the word identify mean? You see that the new brain is what is involved in identifying. You see, identity is an abstract concept. Identity, literally in Latin, means always being the same, you see. The notion that we have got an identity is due to abstract thought. See, that without this abstract thought, you see, the lizard or whatever it is will sort of instinctively define its territory, defend itself. It's more or less built in, right, as a reaction. And that can affect the new brain, you see. Now, but the new brain then builds this up enormously. You see, something which would be fairly small can be built up into something tremendous. You see, like if you have the animal defining its territory, then what usually happens is another animal comes along, and if it comes in, the animal just growls or does something and leaves, or else they have a fight, and whoever wins takes over. The other one just leaves, and it's finished, right? Now, when it comes to human beings, you see, we define territory by thought, right? See, we say there's one country and there's another country, right? It's the way of thinking. It's an assumption, right? And you say it becomes absolutely necessary to defend this country, right? Now, the word necessary is an intellectual concept. It means that which cannot be otherwise, right? But it has a Latin meaning, a root, necessi, meaning don't yield, right? So therefore, is along with the assumption of necessity goes what I call a disposition or an attitude of not yielding, which is emotional, physical, and so on. So I'm saying this is part of the communication between the old brain and the new brain, right? The new brain says this is absolutely necessary, and it communicates to the old brain, don't yield, right? That the old brain doesn't understand absolute necessity. It doesn't understand it cannot be otherwise. That's too subtle for it, or too intellectual for it. It just means don't yield, right? That's the way the lizard feels, right? So but then that unyieldingness is transmitted back to the new brain and says, don't think anything other than you're thinking.
Oh my God.
Huh?
That's good.
Well, it says, otherwise you're liable to yield, right? See, if I think maybe the other side has got a point, then I may start yielding, right?
A few years ago, in the dialogue you had with Krishnamurti, you talked in terms of mankind having taken a wrong turn. Where does what your proposal speaks of now, where does it lie in terms of that wrong turn?
Well, it's a little hard to say. We say that the structure is such as to allow you to go off, you see, in the wrong, between the old and the new brain, right?
In other words,
exactly how men went off, we don't know. Maybe it was inevitable.
But it was in terms of, at that point, it was a structural thing. It was when that structure...
Well, the structure was merely the potential for going off.
Okay. But so then, even then, there may have been people who were whole, who could function with the structure, the neocortex and the old brain. That there was that the development of that did not necessarily mean we had to do that.
No, but it may be that there was something in the situation that slowly built up, you see. Perhaps we'll come back to that later. But some of it may have been with the primates, you see. There was a program on BBC television about Jane Goodall, who was accepted finally by a group of chimpanzees, and she watched them, and there were various things that were very interesting. You see, one was that at one stage some of the chimpanzees moved over to the other side of the mountain, and some of the dominant males somehow conceived a hate for them, began to go over and try to kill them. Right. So I don't know what, but some imaginative concept was developing that these are bad, right? That's what you could guess. And therefore the old brain, see, they already have a fair-sized new brain, you see. And therefore they can get into this problem already.
In relation to primates, since we're talking about them, there's another theory or hypothesis that's bouncing around that has to do with monkeys, the 100th monkey notion.
Yeah.
The notion of wholeness seems to be implied in that.
Yeah, well then the monkeys might also respond that way, working the whole. You see, I think some people feel a monkey is, at least intellectually, equal to a 2-year-old child, and emotionally, well, of course, I was saying that probably it's more not very different from us. You see that the emotional brain of the monkey is not terribly different from our own. And intellectually, it's up to a 2-year-old child, you see.
That implies that wholeness is possible within the...
Well, some kind of wholeness is possible there, but you see, obviously the human being goes further. Now, so where were we about that? The thing possibly it already began to go off from time to time among the monkeys, but not seriously, right? Now, there was also a case where one female monkey began to develop a taste for baby monkeys and would eat them, you see, and just like them, you see. And then it would console the mothers for loss of their babies. but a peculiar taste, you know, when she died, you know, that disappeared, right? Then there was another monkey, a little one, who the mother was too old to push him off when he got mature, so he became dependent on the mother. He could never do anything without her. And finally the mother died, and this baby pined away in about a week and died. So you see, all these problems were arising between the old and the new brain, right? Mm-hmm. Already from time to time among the chimpanzees. But they sort of were sporadic, you know, and didn't build up. Now, See, with human beings, they began to build up, especially, perhaps not in the beginning, but especially as society built up into larger units and more thought was involved, it built up to much more serious problems. See, for example, they became possible to define your country, you see, your tribe, and as opposed to the other one, and you got into that thing. Now, you see, there came the notion, my country above all. You see, that developed with modern nationalism. Germany used to have a song, Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, a very powerful song, which means Germany above all. That's a very simple concept, but intellectually, that's what it means, right? It's absolute necessity, right? And emotionally, it means don't yield, right, to anything. It creates a very powerful emotion, right? So that emotion is so powerful that it overrides the intellect as to what's right and what's wrong and so on. Right? It produces self-deception. It says, you may say that my country is doing something wrong, but you're wrong. My country is right, I find excuses and so on. Right? See, the neocortex has produced this idea of my country. It has fed it to the new brain, the old brain. The old brain has sent off these powerful impulses, and from now on the neocortex is the prisoner of those impulses, right? It is the prisoner of what it itself has created. So, therefore, the problem is far more serious. You see, the greater the intellectual, imaginative power of the new brain, the more serious the problem gets. And see, having created the atomic bomb, the new brain has created a situation that terrifies the old brain. The old brain sends up terrifying feelings, and the new brain is stuck of absolute necessity. It says, you're not allowed to think anything different that might endanger the security of the nation, right? See, not merely that you must protect the security of the nation, but you're not allowed to think any alternative thought that might lead out to something else, right? You see, so the whole thought process is now imprisoned in absolute necessity. That you cannot think otherwise. Now, you see, it's essential for healthy thought that you can always think otherwise. You see, you can always entertain another thought, another proposal, right? You don't have to do it, you see, but you have to be able to think it. Now, if you get to a situation where it becomes unthinkable, then you're really caught, right? You're the prisoner of that whole structure.
Is there a possibility that we can be more than the conflict between the three brains, that there's something that exists even beyond that in our field?
Yes, well, that's what we're exploring. You see, it's saying there might be some movement, some new whole movement of the brain, or something beyond, which is not restricted to starting from one part or the other. You see, if you start, suppose we say we have nationalism and somebody is stuck in that, then he cannot reason himself out of it, because the impulses from the old brain are already freezing him there, right? Saying you mustn't think otherwise. It's treason to think otherwise, right? Now, on the other hand, he cannot get out of it by feeling, you see, because he's already got those feelings, right? See, the reptilian part won't get him out of it. You see, he's that. No partial response is going to get out of this.
Well, how? Maybe this is appropriate. Galileo had his necessity to find out how the universe worked, even though the Inquisition was going to fry him like an egg. Well, what necessity are we using relative to the old brain? Do you think that's a little complicated?
Well, I don't know exactly what motivated Galileo, but you see, there was a complex disagreement between the church and modern science, which was rising. You see, the church's position was that all of these ideas could be considered as hypotheses, but that they should not be considered as realities. You see, the idea that the earth moves or whatever, right? In other words, because the church's position was based on the older ancient Greek Aristotelian ideas about the earth being at the center. So what happened was that religion, religious thought is connected with human search for wholeness, right? People began, that's a very complex story, but you could argue that maybe in the very earliest times, human beings were in contact with nature directly and felt wholeness that way, right? But as they began to form in larger communities that were more isolated from nature, then they began to sense this lack of wholeness, and one of the approaches was through a religion, right? Of saying wholeness is achieved by some religious beliefs, right? Or science to some extent, and philosophy confronted that by thinking of the universe as a whole, right? So culture was involved in the search for wholeness. And now, if people achieve wholeness through a religious belief, that wholeness is necessary now for the harmony of the old brain and the new brain and so on. And if somebody challenges that belief, he is potentially disturbing the whole thing, right? It could all go into chaos. So, therefore, there arises the urge from the old brain to defend this intellectual structure, right? Even against evidence that might suggest it to be false. Is that clear what I mean?
Well, I think so.
Yeah.
If it hadn't been for the church having already set up this desire for wholeness, Galileo's slight shift of this to the scientific realm would not have had results. In other words, psychologically, the church was in an odd sort of sense helping him do it.
Well, the church had built this up, and people all through the society sort of needed the church to give them meaning to life and sense of security and so on. Now, the intellectual leaders of the church could see where it was all leading, right? And therefore, they anticipated the danger, and they tried to convince Galileo that you can play with these ideas as much as you like, but you must not insist that this is reality. It's a useful hypothesis, right? See, they were trying to be very reasonable. And in fact, the evidence was not all that good at that moment on Galileo's side. People analyzed it, and it was ambiguous. You see, Galileo said, how do you know these planets are there, and the moons are around the Jupiter and so on? And he said, look with the telescope. But if he had a very primitive telescope, and if you looked, you would only see little flickering lights. You have to use the thought that, the idea that they are planets would organize that into seeing them as moons. But if you didn't believe there were planets, you would say, what are they? It's just simply some funny flickering lights that I see, right? So, therefore, the whole thing, Galileo was sort of forced to assert his position more strongly than he probably could justify at that moment in order to try to make some progress and resist the church. So they got into a position of confrontation, right? Where neither could really listen properly to the other. Each one had some position to defend. Yeah, and therefore Galileo may have distorted the evidence a bit. It turned out he was right, but on the basis of the evidence he had, it was not all that certain at the time that he was right. Now, this developed in that way, and now we are now developing a scientific view which some people are defending in a way which was similar to the way the church defended its view. That is, many people feel that they make sense of the world through the scientific view, and therefore they feel emotionally threatened if the scientific view is questioned, right? And that the old brain begins to object to questioning the scientific view. And therefore, there's maybe a defense of the scientific view. Then come along the religious people, the fundamentalists, who confront this with the opposite view. Right? And the more each one confronts the other, the more it builds up, right? Each one frightens the other terribly. Huh?
Well, this indicates that by that sort of effort, we're not going to get much of a solution.
No, you see, confrontation does not lead to a solution. It leads to making it worse, right?
This also summarizes what we were talking about earlier when you said, why would the mind deceive itself, or the ego? And having a sense of wholeness based on belief, as was the case in the church in the time of Galileo, belief is self-deception, because when there's knowledge, there's no need for belief.
Yeah, with the belief of that kind, any belief which leads to a defense of itself against evidence is self-deception. Now, you see, we could easily imagine scientific belief getting to be so intense. In fact, very often scientists do defend their positions far beyond where they should, right? Because they're attached to them and believe in them and so on. And so therefore there's a problem which transcends religion or science or any particular human endeavor, right?
When you say confrontation doesn't solve the problem, that would only be true when there is no yielding.
Well, but you see,
confrontation would mean that the confronting parties were willing to make.
Yeah, then it wouldn't be a confrontation. You see, then it would be what I'll call a dialogue, right? Yeah. So you see, if you take the situation between West and East, or America and Russia, they call that dialogue, but it isn't. You see, there's absolute unyielding rigidity in basic positions. They're arguing about the merest tiny little bit, and even that is very hard to do anything about. So the fundamental positions are not in question at all, right? The assumptions behind the societies. But that's what's behind the trouble in the first place, right? So therefore, there's no chance there that anything you can do more than make small adjustments, you see. Now, so anyway, you have this all, and within that context, you build up the emotional excitement of the old brain, which demands defense of certain ideas, and therefore inevitably leads to self-deception. You see, you could say there's no point in defending an idea against any evidence against it, right? Mm-hmm. But rather, you have to look at all the evidence, right? Without defense, right? The ideas should properly be completely vulnerable.
And what we are saying is that the essence of the problem is a interface between, let's just take the suggestion you have, the interface between the old and the new brain in terms of territorial rights. And that is, there may be a proper place for the old brain to do its own things, and also the new brain. However, this surge of emotions, imposing images and so on, back and forth, this is a coordinational problem. Now, system theorists have some suggestions in this, in which the general functioning of one layer of activity can be harmoniously superimposed, where there is a degree of freedom available on the lower layer, and the new layer then leaves up to and coordinates, interfaces, integrates to a degree of what happens down below, and gets a feedback, of course, from down below also. So what you are suggesting is there is a discrepancy in this new layer trying to interface with the old one.
Yes, and vice versa. You see that?
And vice versa.
Yeah, that you see that, and it's connected with some assumptions that the brain is making about itself. You see, this I'm trying to say. We must make the next step. You see that. The brain is, knowing that there's trouble, is beginning to make some assumptions about itself, right? And now one of the assumptions which the brain has, which the mind or brain, whatever you have to call it, has come to make is that, it's become aware that we've got an emotional level and an intellectual, imaginative level, right? And there's some discrepancy between them. I mean, people are generally aware of that. Now, Therefore, now theories and assumptions have developed, gradually. And one of them is that the emotions are one thing and the intellect is another. There are two systems. And that either the intellect, one assumption is the intellect should control the emotions. That is, that if the emotions get too powerful, you try to impose intellect control on them. Right? And saying you've got to have the right emotions, right? Saying you mustn't get too angry, you mustn't get too excited, right? You must love your parents, whether you do or not, and you must enemies, and you must have this attitude to these people and that attitude to those people, and so on. See, so that is one thing, to impose some. The intellect imposes some restrictions on the emotions. It says they are the right emotions to have, and let's try to have them. We may reward people who seem to have them and punish people who don't, right? Saying thereby we hope to encourage people to have the right emotions and so on. Saying that since the old brain is affected by pleasure and pain, you say, let us give pleasurable rewards to people who have the right attitude and give painful stimuli to those who have the wrong attitude. And we thereby hope that the old brain will learn the lesson and have the right emotions, right? See, that's one approach in society. Now, the other approach is, that's the intellectual approach, you see, which is through willpower, right? Saying I must impose the will on the emotions. And you see, the will is a sense of absolute necessity. It is really building up more and more this notion of absolute necessity implying unyielding rigidity, right? Now, therefore, by willpower you try to control it, right? Or by rewards and punishments. Either you try to attract the emotional brain, the old brain, with rewards and frighten it away with punishments, or you try to, by means of the new brain, to use willpower to control it, you see. And the other side is to say, other people say the emotions are the primary thing, right? They're saying, I live an emotional life and the intellect must serve the emotions. Right? And saying, I must have what I want, right? Saying, if I don't, it means I'm weakened, right? I lose my strength. And therefore you have sort of two kinds of people. Those who emphasize the emotional or physical side, the old brain, those who emphasize the new brain. And society tends to operate somewhere between that, moving one side or the other. And now that is a contradiction. See, I'm suggesting that way of operating is a contradiction, right? That it's a contradiction which implies a conflict between the two sides, and therefore a waste of energy and confusion, destruction, some deterioration maybe of the whole physical system. See, so assumptions that are made, you see, let's look at the emotional side, you see, because you may say that actually you may have genuine emotions which arise deeply and which really should take precedence, right? Right. And then besides that you have emotions like anger, fear, hate, and so on. Now at first these may be genuine emotions too, but see, anger usually lasts a short time unless it is sustained by thought, right? When there is thought, then thought sustains anger, and thought may impose anger, saying, I must remain angry or else he will push me around. Or I will lose. So therefore, at a certain stage, you impose anger, but it's concealed that you're doing it. And therefore the assumption is the anger that is imposed is a deep emotion. Therefore it takes on great importance. Saying, I'm right, it's righteous anger.
Well, there is also another assumption that there is only two sides of the story. One could go on and say that, well, if the emotional side is in scramble, yes, there is some imposition, some control, in quotes, by the intellectual side. But how about the intellectual side being lost when it gets its feedback from the emotional side? Could we say that the next layer doesn't have to be necessarily a mental brain-like layer, but could it be that the next layer of integration, which then balances the emotional and intellectual, gives that additional little extra, is insight, is intelligence, which is not necessarily a centralized, local, personalized issue anymore?
Yeah, well, that's some suggested way out. You see, the question is how we would bring that about, right? Now, but we have the way it works now, these two sides, and the thing to notice is that the assumption that the mind or brain has made about how it works has profoundly affected how it works. Right?
In other words, it's self-enclosed right now. The two
Yeah.
layers are feeding on each other.
Yes, but it's due to an assumption. You see, at least it's been facilitated by an assumption. You see, that built up, right? Now, but one of the assumptions we make is that the mind is unaffected by our assumptions about the mind. See, right? See, that's tacit assumption, which sort of is all through the culture. That we say the mind is so and so, that's what it is, and it makes assumptions or doesn't make them. You know, but it's basically the mind all the time, right? And now, but the whole way the mind works is profoundly affected by certain assumptions, especially those involving absolute necessity, right? See, absolute necessity will have a powerful neurophysiological impact. It will affect the way the blood flows, the heart beats, the adrenaline, the neurotransmitters. It will affect the distribution of blood inside the brain. You see that people who make observations show that as people think, the whole blood distribution in the brain is shifting around. You see the blood pressure changes, the whole conditions change. And you see, if you think an assumption that there is danger, that there's something that justifies anger, then this will affect the whole brain, right? But you see, but we have an assumption that thought is a very abstract, ethereal thing that doesn't affect the brain, right? In other words, that thought is merely the intellect, but because of this whole connection of things is so close, that there's such a close connection of all the functions, that as soon as you think something is dangerous, or you assume something is dangerous, something is bad, something is good, it affects the emotions, it affects the blood, it affects the chemistry, it affects everything, you see. It affects the physical, it affects the reptile. And therefore, there's no separation between all these different aspects, right? It's only relatively so for some limited purpose.
But there's been this effort for quite a while to learn for the individual to learn to put themselves in either alpha brainwave or a theta brainwave, which is a sort of waking sleep, in order to quiet the whole thing, and the blood pressure goes down and the whole bit. But they hope that is the way out of the situation, which we suspect it isn't.
Well, I'm suggesting why it's inadequate is that is not the problem. You see, the problem is the kind of assumptions that we are making, which are made by the culture as a whole, which we're not conscious. Assumptions which affect the whole brain. You see, suppose you quiet the whole brain, but you happen to believe in nationalistic assumptions or religious assumptions.
So you still got them.
It'll still flare up, right? You see,
in other words, you're not going to stay in this all the time, and as soon as you come out, you're still an American who's mad at Russia.
Or else you still believe in this religion which says the other side is devils, right? So if you say the other side is a devil, you're going to have a very powerful flare-up of the whole system, right? See, so the assumption that they're the devils and the angels, and that we're the angels and they're the devils, or vice versa, is enough to make the whole system flare up altogether and get out of line, right?
Well, but again, some people say, I'm going to decondition myself. I am going to get rid of all of this stuff. How about it?
Well, that raises the question, who am I? You see, we come back to it. And all this flare-up going on, where am I?
And also another major assumption, I think, underlines such endeavor, including the seeking of insight and great insight and so on, is the wish for a static stability between emotional, intellect, my physical life, and so on. I will be happy ever after type of a thing. And that's, I think, permeates society. You do the right things, then you will settle and all will smoothen out. Could it be that the nature of things available for us is some sort of a dynamic stability in our development, in our growth, in our expansion into the 2 layers, into 4, 5, heaven knows how many, is stability in a sort, stability in growth.
Yeah, well, that's another assumption. We may make that stability is static, but if it turns out that it's really dynamic, then that assumption will also twist up the operation of the brain. You see, a wrong assumption about how the mind or brain or whatever it is works at a deep level with absolute necessity in it is enough to disrupt the whole function. You see, so therefore this function can become unstable. See, I'm saying the human race was evolving with this new brain and the old brain, and the stability of the system depends on the assumptions that it makes about itself. But of course, when the chimpanzees or whatever, the gorillas or no, whatever it was that became human didn't know anything about this at all, right? They suddenly just had the capacity to think, and they thought willy-nilly and made assumptions, right? So they gradually fell into making assumptions that began to disrupt things, and once that began, it sort of got worse, right? There's a tendency for that to build up, right?
Yes, but if you think dynamically about it, one could say that there is nothing wrong with new assumptions, neither in physics nor in life itself, as long as we don't stick to it, we don't grow into it, get solidified in it.
Yeah, but I'm trying to suggest that there is a kind of assumption which, once it's made, sets up a process of self-defense of the assumption.
Yes, but
then you're stuck.
Yeah. Well, not necessarily. One could always make a new assumption.
But you can't. No, you see, let's take the man who he grew up and singing all the time Germany, above all, and all these similar assumptions that were made, and the powerful emotional impact of all that. And then he says, we always can make another assumption: Germany is not above all, right? But he can't. You see, because what I said before was that at a certain stage it is implied that you are not allowed to think differently. That's part of the power of the assumption. The disposition to hold, right?
Are you saying that absolute necessity is an assumption?
Yes. It may be a perception, but it can also be an assumption, right? And it generally is, in fact, in our society.
It's past 12, and we're going to break for lunch and meet at 3 in groups, and maybe you could say something about what we might do when we get together without you in the groups at 3 o'clock.
Oh.
Could you say one a little bit more, please, about that, because it's very interesting. It makes the brain so rigid.
What?
About the assumption, for instance, Deutschland liberalis.
Yeah.
We say that. Then there is nothing else I can function with but with that. It's such a rigidness, it's kind of a deadening thing that paralyzes the brain.
Yes, that it deceives and everything. I'm trying to say that, just let me sum up, we will have to call a halt, right, and discuss the afternoon. Now, the thing I want to sum up is that there are certain kinds of us. Here we have the new brain developing. It doesn't know anything about the old brain or the new brain. It's just there, thinking. And it starts to make assumptions, which it has to do. And it turns out that it starts to make some assumptions of that kind, you see. Something absolutely necessary above all. And that assumption implies that it's got to hold that assumption. You see, you're not allowed to think, even to play with the thought that it could be different. You see, therefore, you have here, you may think you are free to consider another assumption, but if you have that assumption, you are not. You see, so therefore the brain has produced a trap for itself, and which is very hard to get out of. Now, I think all I'm trying to say is let's look at that, you see, saying that is part of the problem which society now faces. The trap is not just individual, but it's cultural and social. It's reinforced all around. And therefore, we want to say that one of the points which, however, opens up a ray of hope, if you want to put it that way, is that the trap is due to that the malfunction of the brain is due to the wrong assumptions the brain has made about itself. Therefore, if somehow these assumptions can be questioned, there seems to be a way out, right? Now, seriously question, that is. Now, okay, so that's the point where perhaps we should stop.